You are about to witness one of the most confusing and explosive moments in recent congressional history, a moment that left lawmakers scratching their heads and the American public demanding real answers about where our loyalties truly lie. We are talking about a showdown that exposes the dark underbelly of international trade deals and the secret handshakes that happen behind closed doors while the cameras are supposedly turned off. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the establishment is terrified of transparency and why a specific exemption for one of our greatest geopolitical adversaries has everyone asking the same question. Make sure you stay with us until the very last second because we are going to break down the specific language used to dodge accountability and what it means for your wallet and your national security. This is not just about tariffs or taxes, this is about the fundamental integrity of our government and whether or not there is a double standard applied to our friends versus our enemies. We are peeling back the curtain on a confrontation that the mainstream media tried to gloss over, but the details are too important to ignore. It was a day that started like any other in the hallowed halls of the Capitol, but the tension in the hearing room was thick enough to cut with a knife as the Committee on Ways and Means prepared to grill the administration on its trade policies. At the center of this storm was the controversial issue of new tariffs, a policy designed to put America first and protect our industries from foreign predation. However, a strange anomaly had surfaced in the paperwork, a detail so glaring that it threatened to derail the entire narrative of economic strength and protectionism. Congressman John Larson, a man known for not suffering fools lightly, sat ready with a dossier of documents that highlighted a baffling contradiction in the administration's strategy regarding the Russian Federation. While our closest allies in Europe and Canada were being hit with tough economic penalties, ostensibly to level the playing field, Russia was seemingly getting a free pass on specific measures. The question on everyone's mind was simple, yet the answer would prove to be anything but straightforward. Why would an administration committed to projecting strength grant leniency to a nation that has consistently undermined American interests on the global stage? As the hearing commenced, all eyes turned to Doug Greer, the trade representative sent to defend the administration's position and explain the logic behind these decisions. Greer looked the part of the seasoned bureaucrat, polished and composed, but beneath the surface, you could sense the unease as he prepared to face a barrage of questions that he likely knew he could not answer fully. Before we dive deeper into this heated exchange and the shocking non-answers that followed, I need you to do something for me right now. If you believe that the American people deserve the unvarnished truth about our government's dealings with foreign powers, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below saying truth. It helps us bypass the algorithm and get this critical information out to more patriots like you who care about the future of this country. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically as Larson leaned into his microphone, his voice steady but laced with an unmistakable edge of incredulity that resonated with everyone watching. He did not waste time with pleasantries or softball questions, instead launching directly into the heart of the matter that had been bothering observers for weeks. He laid out the facts, contrasting the harsh economic hammer being brought down on friendly nations with the velvet glove being extended to Moscow. It was a classic setup for a political ambush, but it was also a legitimate inquiry into the consistency of American foreign policy and the message we were sending to the world. Larson demanded to know the specific rationale, the strategic benefit, or the economic necessity of exempting Russia from the same pain being inflicted on our traditional partners. The silence that followed his opening salvo was deafening, a brief pause where the weight of the accusation hung in the air before the bureaucratic machinery began to whir into motion. Representative Greer cleared his throat and began what can only be described as a masterclass in diplomatic evasion, a style of speaking that says so much while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. He talked about the complexities of the global market, the nuances of supply chains, and the existing sanctions that were already in place against the Russian state. His argument was that the current punitive measures were sufficient and that layering on additional tariffs would be redundant or strategically unnecessary at this juncture. But for anyone listening closely, it sounded less like a strategy and more like an excuse, a way to sidestep the uncomfortable reality that a double standard was indeed in play. Larson was not having it, and he pressed harder, cutting through the jargon to ask the question that every American at home was shouting at their television screens. If we are tough on trade, why are we soft on our biggest rival? This is where the true drama of the hearing began to unfold, as the polite veneer of congressional decorum started to crack under the pressure of relentless scrutiny. Larson pointed out that the public perception of this exemption was disastrous, creating a breeding ground for conspiracy theories and mistrust. When you treat an adversary better than an ally, you invite questions about leverage, about hidden agendas, and about who is really pulling the strings behind the scenes. The exchange grew heated as Greer refused to deviate from his script, repeating the same talking points about strict existing sanctions without addressing the specific tariff exemption in question. It was a frustrating display of the kind of stonewalling that has made millions of Americans lose faith in the institutions that are supposed to serve them. We were watching a government official look an elected representative in the eye and essentially refuse to answer the question, hiding behind a wall of vague assurances and bureaucratic speak. You have to wonder what was going through Greer's mind as he sat there, realizing that his answers were not landing and that the optics of the situation were spiraling out of control. Was he protecting a sensitive diplomatic channel, or was he simply covering up a policy blunder that made no sense even to the people tasked with enforcing it? The lack of clarity was not just annoying, it was dangerous, fueling the very skepticism that Larson was warning about. As the back and forth continued, it became clear that this was not just about tariffs on aluminum or steel, but about the fundamental transparency of the executive branch. Larson argued that by failing to provide a clear, logical reason for the Russian exemption, the administration was stoking the fires of doubt regarding the president's relationship with Putin. It was a heavy accusation, but in the absence of a solid explanation, it was the only conclusion that made sense to a logical observer. Now, pause for a second and think about how many times we have seen this play out in Washington, where the unelected bureaucracy decides what you need to know and what you don't. It is infuriating, and it is exactly why we cover stories like this. If you are tired of the runaround and want to see more content that holds these officials' feet to the fire, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and share this video with a friend who needs a wake-up call. The hearing pressed on, and Larson decided to change tactics, moving from the specific economic data to the broader geopolitical implications of the move. He painted a picture of a world where American allies were confused and alienated, wondering why they were being punished while Moscow was being spared. It was a powerful argument that resonated with the values of loyalty and strength that the Republican Party has always championed. Greer, however, remained unmoved, sticking to his line that the administration's actions were part of a broader, more complex strategy that could not be fully dissected in an open hearing. He hinted at national security concerns and delicate negotiations, the classic "trust us, we know what we are doing" defense that rarely satisfies anyone. But Larson was relentless, pointing out that trust is a currency that this administration was rapidly spending without replenishing. The frustration in the room was palpable, not just from the Democrats, but from anyone who believes that governance requires accountability. The refusal to commit to future actions or to explain the criteria for the exemption left a gaping hole in the administration's narrative of America First. How does it put America first to give a pass to a country that interferes in our elections and threatens our interests, while taxing the goods coming from countries that have fought by our side? This contradiction was the elephant in the room, and no amount of smooth talking from Doug Greer could make it disappear. The clash between Larson and Greer highlighted a fundamental disconnect between the rhetoric of the campaign trail and the reality of governing. On the stump, everything was simple and black and white, but in the committee room, everything was a shade of gray that allowed for uncomfortable compromises. Larson's interrogation eventually turned to the issue of public trust, a cornerstone of any functioning republic. He argued that when the government acts in ways that seem inexplicable or contradictory, it breeds cynicism and apathy among the electorate. People start to believe that the game is rigged, that the outcomes are predetermined, and that their vote doesn't matter because the real decisions are made in secret. Greer's response to this was perhaps the most telling moment of the entire hearing, as he seemed to dismiss the public's concern as a result of media spin rather than a legitimate reaction to the facts at hand. He implied that the average American simply didn't understand the high-level chess game being played, a condescending attitude that only served to inflame the situation further. It was the epitome of the deep state arrogance that so many conservatives have railed against for years. The arrogance of assuming that the people cannot handle the truth is a dangerous path for any administration to walk. Larson hammered this point home, reminding Greer that he worked for the taxpayers, not the other way around. The money being discussed, the tariffs being levied or waived, ultimately impacted the bank accounts of working families across the nation. As we move deeper into the analysis of this confrontation, we have to look at the specific language Greer used to deflect the questions. He used phrases like ongoing assessment and strategic flexibility, terms that sound professional but essentially mean we reserve the right to do whatever we want without explaining it. It is the language of the swamp, designed to confuse and bore the listener into submission. But Larson was not bored, and neither are we. We know that these words are shields used to protect weak policies from strong scrutiny. The refusal to say yes or no to simple questions about whether Russia would ever face these tariffs was a glaring admission of uncertainty or, worse, complicity. The tension reached a boiling point when Larson directly asked if there was any scenario in which Russia would lose its exemption. Greer paused, looked at his notes, and gave a non-answer that was so convoluted it would have been funny if the stakes weren't so high. He talked about conditionalities and evolving landscapes, but he never said the words yes, if they violate our terms. This inability to draw a red line was shocking to those who expected a projection of strength. It made the administration look weak, hesitant, and beholden to interests that were not immediately apparent. Larson seized on this weakness, characterizing the administration's stance as soft and compromised. The visual of the hearing was just as striking as the audio, with Larson gesturing emphatically with his stack of papers while Greer sat frozen, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. It was a clash of styles, the passionate advocate for oversight versus the cool, detached operator of the machinery of state. For the viewer, it was a clear demonstration of why congressional hearings are essential theater in a democracy. But let's be honest, Theater is only useful if it leads to action or revelation. In this case, the revelation was that the government had no good answer for why it was favoring Russia. The action, unfortunately, was non-existent, as Greer refused to budge or offer any new commitments. This standoff is symbolic of a larger problem in Washington, where the executive branch has accumulated so much power that it feels comfortable ignoring the legislative branch. Congress asks questions, and the agencies shrug. It is a constitutional crisis in slow motion, and it is happening right in front of our eyes. If you are as outraged as I am by this lack of accountability, don't just sit there. Scroll down to the comments section and tell us what you think the real reason for the Russian exemption is. Is it strategy? Is it fear? Or is it something else entirely? We want to hear your theories because the official story just doesn't add up. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We are building a community of critical thinkers here. The ramifications of this hearing rippled out far beyond that committee room. Financial markets reacted, allies sent confused cables back to their capitals, and political pundits on both sides of the aisle went into overdrive. But for the regular folks in the Rust Belt or the Heartland, it was just another example of Washington doing things that don't make sense for the common man. Why should a steelworker in Pennsylvania worry about his job due to tariffs on Canada while Russian steel might get a pass? It defies the logic of economic nationalism that was sold to the voters. Larson tried to bridge this gap, to give voice to the confusion of the electorate, but he was met with a stone wall. We are going to continue to unpack this story, looking at the days and weeks that followed this explosive hearing. We will see how the media spun it, how the White House tried to do damage control, and what eventually happened to those controversial exemptions. The story doesn't end when the gavel falls. In fact, that is usually when the real maneuvering begins. Stay tuned as we peel back the next layer of this onion. You won't believe how the administration tried to justify this later on, and the excuses only got more bizarre. This is the kind of political drama that you can't make up, and it is all on the public record if you know where to look. We have to dig deeper into the pile of documents that Congressman Larson slammed onto the table because that is where the real story is hidden. While the cameras were focused on the faces of the men speaking, the true scandal was buried in the fine print of the trade agreement modifications that most people never bother to read. Larson had done his homework, and what he found was a roadmap of hypocrisy that seemed designed to confuse the American public. He pointed to specific annexes in the tariff proclamation that carved out exceptions so narrow they could only apply to a handful of entities, and coincidentally, those entities were tied directly to Russian state interests. It was not a broad policy shift, it was a targeted bailout disguised as diplomatic nuance. The specifics of the exemption were mind-boggling when you compared them to the treatment of our neighbors to the north. At that very moment, Canadian aluminum was being flagged as a potential national security threat, a designation that allowed the administration to slap heavy duties on imports crossing the northern border. Yet, here was Larson, holding up proof that raw materials from the Russian Federation were bypassing these same strict scrutiny measures under the guise of supply chain necessity. It begged the question of how a friendly nation with whom we share the world's longest undefended border could be a threat, while a nuclear-armed adversary was deemed a necessary partner. Greer tried to pivot to the technical definitions of the materials involved, launching into a dry explanation of alloy grades and industrial requirements. He sounded more like a college professor lecturing a board class than a public servant answering for a geopolitical blunder. He claimed that the specific types of metal coming from Russia were not available in sufficient quantities from domestic or allied sources, thus necessitating the waiver. But Larson was ready for this excuse, countering with data from American manufacturers who had been begging for the chance to fill those very orders. It was a classic case of the government picking winners and losers, and in this round, the American worker was losing to the Russian oligarch. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch as Larson read a quote from a domestic steel executive who stated that his factory was running at half capacity while Russian ships were unloading cargo at our ports duty-free. This wasn't just abstract politics anymore. This was about the livelihoods of families in the Rust Belt who had voted for protection and were getting sold out. If you are sick and tired of seeing American businesses get the short end of the stick while our rivals get a handout, take a second to smash that like button and comment America First below. We need to show the algorithm that we care about our own economy before we worry about the profit margins of foreign competitors. Every comment helps us expose these inconsistencies to a wider audience that the mainstream media ignores. The exchange then shifted to the rationale of national security, a phrase that has been used to justify everything from surveillance to wars, and now, apparently, trade favoritism. Larson pressed Greer on how exactly allowing Russian economic influence to grow within our borders contributed to our safety. It was a logical trap, and everyone saw it coming except, apparently, for the man in the witness chair. Greer stammered, reverting to his talking points about keeping diplomatic channels open and not pushing Moscow into a corner. But since when has the strategy of appeasement ever worked for the United States or any other free nation? The philosophy of peace through strength seemed to have been abandoned in that hearing room in favor of peace through profit. Larson hammered this point, asking why the administration was willing to risk alienating NATO allies by hitting them with tariffs while tiptoeing around Putin's sensibilities. It painted a picture of an administration that was tough on its friends and submissive to its enemies, a reversal of the natural order that left traditional conservatives reeling. The visual of Greer wiping his brow, shifting uncomfortably in his suit, told you everything you needed to know about his confidence in his own arguments. He knew he was losing the room, and he knew that the clips of this testimony would be played on evening news segments across the country. He tried to suggest that the sanctions already in place were doing enough damage to the Russian economy, implying that we didn't need to pile on. Larson, however, pointed out that sanctions are only effective if they are comprehensive and that these loopholes were essentially leakages in the dam we were trying to build. There is something deeply unsettling about watching a government official struggle to defend the indefensible, twisting logic into pretzels to avoid stating the obvious truth. It became clear that this decision didn't originate from a coherent strategy but likely from a transactional deal made far above Greer's pay grade. He was the fall guy, sent out to take the heat for a policy that made no sense on paper because its real justification was likely hidden in a private conversation. This is the kind of shadowy governance that makes people believe in the deep state, the idea that the real power operates in the dark, immune to the will of the voters. Larson then turned to the issue of reciprocity, a core tenet of fair trade that the Republican Party has championed for decades. He asked simply, what are we getting in return for this generosity? The silence that followed was longer and more painful than any of Greer's previous pauses. There was no concession from Russia, no pullback in Ukraine, no cessation of cyber attacks, and no cooperation on counterterrorism. We were giving away leverage for absolutely nothing, a bad deal by any standard of business or diplomacy. The hearing room, usually a place of polite murmurs and shuffling papers, had fallen completely silent as everyone waited for Greer to pull a rabbit out of his hat. He didn't. Instead, he mumbled something about long-term strategic horizons, a fancy way of saying just wait and see. But the American people have been waiting and seeing for years, and what they see is their influence waning and their leaders capitulating. It is moments like this that remind us why we need constant vigilance and why we cannot simply trust the A or D next to a politician's name. We need to look at their actions, at the bills they sign, and the exemptions they grant. If a policy smells wrong, if it contradicts the very platform the administration ran on, we have a duty to call it out loud and clear. This brings us to the most dangerous aspect of Greer's testimony, the implication that the American public doesn't need to know the details because they are too complex. This elitist attitude is the poison in our political bloodstream. Larson, to his credit, refused to accept this, demanding that the criteria for these exemptions be made public immediately. He argued that if the reasons were legitimate, the administration should be proud to share them, not hide them behind a veil of classification. Greer's refusal to commit to transparency was the final nail in the coffin for his credibility that day. He cited proprietary business information as a shield, protecting the identities of the companies benefiting from this Russian trade. Think about that for a second. The government was prioritizing the privacy of corporations dealing with our adversary over the right of the American people to know who is selling them out. If you want to know the names of these companies and the politicians who protect them, make sure you subscribe to our channel right now. We are launching a full investigation into the corporate beneficiaries of these loopholes, and you won't want to miss our upcoming special report. Hit that notification bell so you are the first to know when we drop the names. The narrative of the hearing then took a turn towards the personal, as Larson questioned whether Greer himself believed in the policy he was defending. It was a harsh tactic, questioning a man's integrity, but the circumstances seemed to warrant it. Greer stiffened, replying that he served at the pleasure of the president and executed the policies as directed. It was the "I was just following orders" defense, a historically weak position that rarely absolves one of moral responsibility. By shifting the blame upward, Greer inadvertently confirmed that this was a directive coming from the very top, bypassing the usual interagency review processes. This revelation sent shockwaves through the committee, as it suggested a centralization of power that bypassed the checks and balances designed to prevent such anomalies. If the president or his inner circle could unilaterally waive penalties for a hostile power, what was the point of having a trade representative or a Congress at all? Larson seized on this, portraying the situation not just as a bad policy, but as a constitutional overreach. He argued that Congress had authorized tariffs to protect national security, not to be used as bargaining chips in secret personal deals. The anger in his voice reflected the frustration of a legislative branch that has seen its authority eroded year after year. But let's pause and look at this through the lens of the average voter in a swing state. They don't care about congressional procedure, they care about strength and fairness. When they see their leader looking weak before Putin, it hurts their national pride. When they see unfair rules, it hurts their sense of justice. This hearing was a disaster because it struck at both of those core American values. Greer tried one last time to regain the offensive, claiming that the administration's unpredictable nature was actually a strategic asset, keeping our enemies guessing. He argued that the inconsistency was intentional, a part of the madman theory of diplomacy where you keep your opponents off balance. It was a bold attempt to spin chaos as genius, but in the context of trade enforcement, businesses need certainty, not surprises. Larson dismantled this by pointing out that our allies were the ones guessing, while our enemies seemed to know exactly which buttons to push to get what they wanted. He noted that the Russians didn't seem confused or intimidated, they seemed emboldened, continuing their aggressive behavior on the world stage. The strategy was failing in real time, and the exemption was just one piece of the evidence of that failure. The hearing ended not with a bang, but with a simmering sense of unresolved conflict. Greer gathered his papers and left quickly, avoiding the press gaggle waiting outside the doors. Larson stayed behind, talking to reporters, framing the day as a victory for truth but a defeat for policy. The aftermath of this confrontation was immediate and furious. Conservative talk radio, usually supportive of the administration, found itself split. Some hosts tried to defend the move as 4D chess, while others, the true constitutionalists, called it out for what it was, a mistake. The rift exposed the difference between blind loyalty to a person and loyalty to the principles of the movement. We saw op-eds appearing in the days that followed, written by trade experts who confirmed Larson's technical arguments. They validated that there was no economic justification for the Russian exemption that held water. The only remaining explanations were political or personal, neither of which is acceptable in a transparent democracy. As we reflect on this chapter, we have to ask ourselves what it means for the future of the America First movement. Can we truly put America first if we are putting Russia ahead of our own allies and industries? It is a hard question, but one that we must answer if we want to save this country from the swamp that threatens to swallow it whole. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments section. Do you think Greer was hiding something, or was he just incompetent? We read every single comment to keep our finger on the pulse of the Real America. And please, share this video with your family, even the liberal ones, because the truth is nonpartisan. We are going to keep following the money and the influence peddling that led to this disastrous hearing. In the next part of our series, we will look at how the media tried to cover this up and the surprising fallout that happened when the public finally started paying attention. You won't believe who stepped forward to blow the whistle on the internal chaos that led to this decision. You would think that a hearing exposing a direct contradiction in national security policy involving our biggest adversary would be front-page news across every major paper in the country. You would expect the talking heads on cable news to be dissecting every word Doug Greer said, analyzing his body language, and asking the tough questions about who really authorized these exemptions. But if you turned on your TV the night after that explosive confrontation, what did you see? You saw fluff pieces about the weather, celebrity gossip, and recycled political drama that had nothing to do with the fact that American sovereignty was being sold down the river. The silence from the mainstream media was not just incompetence, it was a coordinated blackout designed to protect the establishment from the wrath of the voters. They knew that if the average steelworker in Ohio or the aluminum manufacturer in Kentucky fully understood that their government was prioritizing Russian profits over American jobs, there would be a revolt. So, they did what they always do, and they buried the story. They relegated it to the back pages of the business section, using dry, technical headlines that no one would click on, hoping the news cycle would move on before anyone noticed the smoking gun sitting on the table. But they forgot one thing, they don't control the flow of information anymore. We do. Channels like this, and patriots like you who refuse to be spoon-fed the official narrative, kept this story alive. We saw through the fog of silence and realized that the lack of coverage was actually the biggest indicator of how damaging this scandal really was. When the media refuses to bark, you know the burglar is already in the house. While the press was busy looking the other way, the phones in Congressman Larson's office were ringing off the hook. But it wasn't just angry constituents calling, it was insiders. We have since learned that in the days following the hearing, a number of career officials within the Trade Representative's office began to quietly reach out, looking for a way to blow the whistle on what was happening behind closed doors. These were not partisan hacks, these were the number crunchers and the analysts who had spent their lives studying trade flows and national security. They were horrified by what they were seeing. According to leaked memos that eventually surfaced, the decision to exempt Russia did not come from the usual bottom-up review process where experts weigh the pros and cons. There was no economic impact study, no security clearance review, and no consultation with our intelligence agencies. Instead, the order came down from the very top, bypassing every single check and balance that is supposed to prevent corruption. It was a must-pass directive that landed on Greer's desk with explicit instructions to make it happen, regardless of the optics or the strategic fallout. This is the definition of the deep state in action, but not in the way the media tells you. This wasn't some shadowy cabal of liberals. This was a rot within the executive branch itself, where unelected advisors were making decisions that impacted the global balance of power without any accountability to the American people. One whistleblower described the atmosphere in the office as chaotic and fearful. Staffers were told not to ask questions and to simply process the paperwork. They were instructed to use vague language about supply chain stability to justify the waivers, even though they knew full well that domestic supply was more than adequate. This is the smoking gun that turns this from a policy disagreement into a full-blown scandal. It implies that Greer lied to Congress when he claimed there was a strategic rationale. There was no strategy, there was just an order. If you believe that bureaucrats who lie to Congress should be fired and prosecuted, hit that subscribe button right now. We are the only ones demanding accountability for these unelected officials who think they are above the law. Join our movement and help us drain the swamp for real. The revelation of these internal leaks fundamentally changed the nature of the conversation. It was no longer just about tariffs, it was about the integrity of the presidency itself. Who had the president's ear? Who convinced him that giving Putin a pass was a good idea? Was it a business associate with ties to Moscow? Was it a lobbyist trading on old favors? The questions were swirling, and the silence from the White House was deafening. Meanwhile, out in the real world, the consequences of this policy were starting to bite. American companies that had ramped up production in anticipation of a level playing field were suddenly left holding the bag. Orders were cancelled as cheaper Russian materials flooded the market, bypassing the very tariffs that were supposed to stop them. We spoke to a small business owner in Pennsylvania who makes specialized parts for the auto industry. He told us he had to lay off 15 workers the week after the exemptions were announced. I voted for this administration because they promised to protect us, he said, his voice shaking with anger. I thought they were going to put America first. Instead, I'm watching my business die while some oligarch in Moscow buys another yacht. It's a betrayal." That word, betrayal, started to echo across the conservative base. For years, we have defended this administration against the relentless attacks of the left. We called out the Russia hoax for the fabrication that it was. But now, faced with actual evidence of favoritism toward Russia that hurt American workers, loyalists found themselves in a crisis of faith. It is one thing to defend your leader against lies, it is another thing entirely to watch him sign off on a policy that destroys the very people who put him in power. This is where the political genius of John Larson, yes, a Democrat, but in this moment, an ally of the truth, shone through. He didn't gloat. He didn't make it about "I told you so." He made it about the worker. He held town halls in districts that had voted overwhelmingly Republican, and he listened. He showed them the documents. He explained the loophole. And for the first time in a long time, the partisan divide evaporated. An angry steelworker doesn't care if the guy fighting for him has an R, S or a D next to his name, he cares about who is telling the truth. The fractures within the Republican Party began to widen. The populist wing, the true believers in economic nationalism, started to demand answers. Senators who usually walked in lockstep with the White House began to issue carefully worded statements expressing concern about the trade imbalance. It was a polite way of saying, "Fix this before we lose the midterms." But the establishment wing, the corporate Republicans who care more about stock prices than sovereignty, stayed silent. They were likely lobbying for these very exemptions behind the scenes, protecting the multinational corporations that fund their campaigns. This highlighted the civil war happening within the conservative movement, the battle between the globalists who want cheap labor and cheap materials, and the nationalists who want strong borders and strong industry. The media blackout eventually cracked, not because of journalistic integrity, but because the noise from the grassroots became too loud to ignore. Local news stations started picking up the story, interviewing the laid-off workers and the confused business owners. The narrative was slipping away from the administration's control. They tried to spin it as a temporary measure, a cooling-off period to allow for negotiations. But the timeline didn't add up. You don't grant a massive economic concession before you start negotiating, and that's negotiation 101. You hold your leverage until you get what you want. We gave away the store and got nothing in return. We also need to talk about the strange coincidence of timing. These exemptions were finalized just days after a high-level private phone call between the president and Putin. A call for which no transcript was ever released. Now, I am not a conspiracy theorist, but I am a pattern recognition expert. When a call happens, and 3 days later a massive favor is granted with no public explanation, you have to be willfully blind not to see the connection. What was discussed on that call? Did Putin ask for a favor? Did he threaten something? Or was it a transactional deal, you scratch my back, I scratch yours? The lack of transparency breeds the worst kind of speculation. And in the absence of truth, rumors fill the void. This is dangerous for a democracy. We need to know that our foreign policy is being conducted in the national interest, not as a personal favor bank for the elite. As the pressure mounted, Greer was called back for a second round of questioning, this time behind closed doors in a classified setting. We don't have the transcripts of that meeting, but sources say it was a bloodbath. Lawmakers from both parties, armed with the whistleblower information, cornered him. They demanded the names of the individuals who ordered the exemption. They wanted to see the paper trail. Rumor has it that Greer cracked. He admitted that the pressure came from external advisors who had direct access to the Oval Office, bypassing the trade representative entirely. This confirmed our worst fears, that there was a shadow government operating within the White House, a group of unelected influencers who were steering the ship of state based on their own private interests. This is the ultimate betrayal of the voter. We elect a president, not his donors, not his son-in-law, and not his golf buddies. When policy is made by people who are not accountable to the public, we cease to be a republic. If you are as sick of the shadow government as I am, leave a comment below saying no more secrets. We need to send a message that we are watching, and we will not accept governance by proxy. Your comment helps boost this video so more people can wake up to the reality of what is happening in Washington. The economic fallout continued to ripple outward. The uncertainty created by these arbitrary exemptions made the markets jittery. Investors hate unpredictability. If the rules can change overnight because of a secret phone call, how can anyone plan for the future? Capital started to flee the manufacturing sector, moving into safer, less volatile assets. The very revitalization of American industry that was the centerpiece of the campaign was being undermined by the administration's own erratic behavior. Larson kept the pressure on, releasing a new report that calculated the cost of these exemptions to the American taxpayer. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars in potential tariff revenue were lost, money that could have been used to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure or pay down the national debt. Instead, that money stayed in the pockets of Russian oligarchs and the multinational corporations that do business with them. It was a wealth transfer from the American people to the Russian elite, plain and simple. The most frustrating part of this entire saga is the hypocrisy. Imagine for a second if a Democrat president had done this. Imagine if Obama or Biden had granted a massive trade waiver to Russia while attacking our allies. The outcry from the right would have been deafening. Impeachment articles would have been drafted the next day. But because it was our guy, too many people stayed silent for too long. We have to be better than that. Principles must matter more than parties. If we only call out corruption when the other side does it, we are no better than the hypocrites we claim to despise. True patriotism means holding your own side to the highest standard, not the lowest. As we move toward the climax of this story, you need to understand that this wasn't just a one-off mistake. It was a symptom of a much deeper disease. The America First slogan was being hollowed out, used as a branding exercise while the actual policies were being sold to the highest bidder. The whistleblowers who came forward took a massive risk. They risked their careers, their pensions, and their reputations to tell us the truth. We owe it to them to make sure their sacrifice wasn't in vain. We need to share this story, to talk about it at the dinner table, to force our representatives to go on the record. In the next part of this series, we are going to look at the endgame. We will see how the administration tried to reverse course when the polling numbers started to tank. We will expose the frantic damage control, the scapegoating of mid-level officials, and the eventual quiet cancellation of the exemptions when they thought no one was looking. But we were looking. And we remember. Stay tuned, because the cover-up is always worse than the crime, and the way they tried to clean up this mess is almost as shocking as the mess itself. You won't want to miss how this story ends. The panic inside the West Wing was not visible from the street, but for those who know how to read the signs, it was as clear as day. When the internal polling numbers from the Rust Belt states started to trickle in, the mood shifted from arrogance to fear. The political strategists, the ones who usually laugh off complaints from the working class, suddenly realized they had a major problem on their hands. The data showed that the base was not just annoyed, and they were furious. The story of the Russian exemptions had jumped the fence from the policy wonks to the union halls, and it was threatening to undercut the president's core message of economic nationalism. You could almost hear the gears grinding in reverse as the administration scrambled to find a way out of the mess they had created. The strategic flexibility defense that Doug Greer had clung to so desperately was abandoned overnight. Suddenly, the talking points sent out to surrogates changed. No longer were they defending the exemptions as a necessary geopolitical maneuver. Now, the narrative was that it was all a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic oversight, or an administrative error caused by holdovers from the previous administration. It is the oldest trick in the Washington playbook, and when you get caught with your hand in the cookie jar, blame the jar. They tried to paint the picture that the president was unaware of the specific details, that he had been ill-advised by mid-level staffers who didn't understand his vision. It was a pathetic attempt to insulate the leadership from the consequences of their own decisions, but it was the only card they had left to play. And then came the sacrificial lamb. We all knew it was coming. Doug Greer, the man who had sat in that chair and taken the heat, the man who had dutifully recited the lines he was given, was thrown under the bus. Within weeks of that disastrous hearing, rumors began to circulate that Greer was spending more time with his family or looking to pursue opportunities in the private sector. It is the polite way of saying he was fired for the crime of getting caught. Watching Greer take the fall was a reminder of how the game is played. Loyalty in Washington is a one-way street. You are expected to lie for your bosses, but when those lies stop working, you are the first one they cut loose. Greer was no hero, he was part of the problem, but his unceremonious exit proved that the administration knew exactly how toxic this policy had become. They needed a head on a spike to appease the angry voters, and Greer was the most convenient target. But firing one guy doesn't fix a broken policy. The exemptions were still on the books, and Russian metal was still flowing into our ports. This is where the story gets even more cynical. The administration knew they couldn't announce a formal reversal without admitting they were wrong. They couldn't hold a press conference and say, "We made a mistake, and we are fixing it," because that would look weak. So, they did what cowards always do, and they did it in the dark. On a Friday evening, late in the day when the news cycle is winding down and reporters are heading home for the weekend, the Department of Commerce quietly updated its website. There was no press release, no fanfare, no tweets. Just a dry, regulatory filing that effectively revoked the specific exclusion codes that had been granted to the Russian entities. It was a Friday news dump classic. They hoped that by Monday morning, something else would be dominating the headlines, a celebrity scandal, a natural disaster, anything, and that nobody would notice that they had completely capitulated. But we noticed. Congressman Larson noticed. And the American workers who had been screaming for months noticed. The flow of Russian imports stopped just as mysteriously as it had started. This quiet reversal was a victory, make no mistake about it. It proved that when we shine a light on the cockroaches, they scatter. It proved that public pressure, fueled by independent media and engaged citizens, can still force the hand of the most powerful people on earth. But it was a hollow victory because the damage had already been done. For months, our adversary had profited at our expense. For months, our allies had questioned our loyalty. And for months, our government had lied to us. If you are proud to be part of the movement that forced this change, hit that like button. It wasn't the politicians who fixed this, it was you. It was your comments, your shares, and your refusal to accept the official story that made the difference. Never let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. The aftermath of the reversal was a masterclass in gaslighting. Once the exemptions were gone, the administration suddenly pivoted back to talking tough on Russia. They touted the revocation as proof of their strict enforcement of trade laws, conveniently leaving out the part where they were the ones who granted the exemptions in the first place. They tried to take credit for putting out the fire that they themselves had started. This is why it is so hard to trust anything that comes out of DC. They create a crisis, let their donors profit from it, and then when the public gets wise, they solve the crisis and ask for your vote. It is a perpetual motion machine of corruption. The media, of course, let them get away with it. The headlines shifted to administration toughens stance on Moscow, completely ignoring the context of the previous 6 months. But for those of us paying attention, the mask had slipped. We saw that the rhetoric of America First was being used as a shield to hide policies that were anything but. We realized that there are elements within the party structure that are just as globalist, just as beholden to foreign interests, as the Democrats they claim to fight. It was a wake-up call that the battle for the soul of the country is not just between the left and the right, but between the people and the establishment. The Larson Greer hearing should be required viewing for every civics class in America. It showed the system at its worst and its best. It showed the arrogance of power, the evasiveness of bureaucracy, but also the power of oversight and the necessity of accountability. Larson, despite being a Democrat with whom we disagree on almost everything else, performed a public service by exposing this specific rot. It reminds us that truth is not partisan. If a Democrat uncovers corruption in a Republican administration, we should listen. If a Republican uncovers corruption in a Democrat administration, we should listen. The truth is the only thing that matters. As the dust settled, the impact on the midterm elections began to take shape. The candidates who aligned themselves too closely with the establishment's trade blunders found themselves facing tough primary challenges. The voters were looking for authentic voices, for people who wouldn't sell them out for a seat at the table. This scandal became a litmus test. Where did you stand on the Russian exemptions? Became the question that every candidate had to answer. The legacy of this incident is a heightened sense of skepticism. We don't just take their word for it anymore. When they announce a new trade deal, we read the fine print. When they slap sanctions on a country, we check the list of exceptions. We have become an army of citizen journalists, fact-checking the fact-checkers and holding our leaders to a standard they are not used to. This brings us to the present day. Why are we talking about this now? Because history has a nasty habit of repeating itself. The same advisors who pushed for those exemptions are still lurking in the background. They move from think tanks to lobbying firms to administration posts, a revolving door of influence peddling that never stops. They are waiting for us to fall asleep, for us to get distracted by the next shiny object, so they can go back to business as usual. We cannot let that happen. We have to stay vigilant. We have to keep asking the uncomfortable questions. Who benefits? Follow the money. Whenever a policy doesn't make sense for the American people, you can bet your bottom dollar it makes sense, millions of them, for someone else. The story of the Russian tariff exemptions is a cautionary tale about the fragility of our sovereignty. It showed us how easily our national interests can be subverted by a few well-placed phone calls and a compliant bureaucracy. But it also showed us that we are not powerless. When we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced, we can stop the sellout. So, what is the next step? It is simple. We need to build this community. We need to make this channel a fortress of truth in a sea of lies. I need you to commit to being an active participant in this fight. Don't just watch the video and move on. Share it with 5 people today. Post it on your social media. Email it to your congressman. Let them know that we know. We are going to continue to dig into the archives, to find the other stories they buried, the other deals they hid. There is so much more to uncover. The swamp is deep, but our resolve is stronger. We are not going anywhere. In the coming weeks, we will be releasing a deep dive into the specific lobbyists who were seen entering the White House in the days leading up to the exemption order. We have names, we have dates, and we have the connections that tie them to foreign entities. You will be shocked to see who is really pulling the strings. It is not who you think it is. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for being a patriot. The fight for America's future is happening right now, and you are on the front lines. Together, we will ensure that our government remains of the people, by the people, and for the people, not for the special interests and not for foreign powers. Remember to subscribe, hit the bell so you never miss an upload, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on how we can better hold these officials accountable. Until next time, stay sharp, stay skeptical, and keep fighting the good fight.